One of our guest preachers from earlier this year, Shonda Jha, director of the Oakland Peace Center, reminded us that the Bible text we read in church is not always about us, thank God, because I would not want to be called out as a Pharisee, a hypocrite, a burden layer, a pious preener, a fringe lover. I love a good fringe, but mostly in the form of a protest movement, not a religious accessory. And there are fairly good odds that you don't fall into the category of religious hypocrites Jesus was condemning either, because he called out people who love the VIP seats in church. And from where I sit each week, I can clearly see that the front pew is always empty. Carmen and Dorothy like to sit there sometimes. I think it might be because you're afraid I'm going to call on you in the sermon and you won't know the answer. But I'll attribute it to your natural humility. According to the Gospels of Matthew and John, Jesus was hard on the Pharisees, all of them, and that has given Christians all kinds of license to anti-Semitism. But I think we know that Jesus' intention was not to call out fellow Jews, but instead anyone who had some religious authority and misused it, who inflicted spiritual abuse on seekers coming for God's love, who excluded or judged or lay heavy burdens on others of compliance with an orthodoxy without lifting a finger themselves. The irony of the Pharisees is that they were once reformers, the Martin Luthers, the William Tyndales of their times, but as they say, power corrupts. The revolutionary who once nailed theses to the cathedral door or stormed the palace gates, once they get access to a little privilege, a little power, a little comfort, a nice seat, it's hard to give it up. We get used to it. It's basic human nature. And within the church, sometimes the spiritual movements that set us free harden into religious institutions that risk caging God with a new orthodoxy that replaces the old ones we sought to throw away. I'm not saying institutions are bad. We are sitting in one right now. Institutions are important. Physical plants, seminaries, ordination processes, church budgets, all these things regulate and secure religious communities for future generations so that Jesus' words and ideas still have a place to proliferate. It's complicated. As senior minister, I'm charged with both protecting what we have built here at First Church and with growing the church, with making room for new winds and new orthodoxies and new movements. And sometimes these mandates feel like conflicting tasks. Let me lead you in a little thought experiment. On the first day of school this year, Carmen came home from 6th grade with a handout from her math teacher. She wanted to teach me all about the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. I was hearing about this for the first time. And I learned from her and from this concept that a Stanford psychologist had done research that yielded stunning results about human potential. Teachers had two groups of students. They praised one group for their intelligence, and they praised the second group for their effort. And then they gave them exactly the same math tests that got increasingly harder. The students who were praised for their intelligence did well until they didn't. As soon as they encountered problems that were difficult, they gave up in frustration. They figured their smarts had taken them as far as they could go, and that was that. Worse, when they learned they had gotten a problem wrong, they weren't even interested in the right answer because they had adopted that fixed mindset. On the other hand, the kids praised for effort were curious about the answers they got wrong. They wanted to figure out where they went wrong and learn from their mistakes. They had a growth mindset. They were only limited in what they could do by how hard they were willing to work, experiment, fail, and then learn from their mistakes. The scariest result of the experiment was the fixed mindset kids were asked to write individual letters to their growth mindset peers with a space for reporting how they had done on the tests. And to Dweck's devastation, Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist, the most toxic byproduct of the fixed mindset turned out to be dishonesty, because 40% of the ability praised kids, the intelligence praised kids, lied about their score. They made their scores higher so that they could look more successful. And the psychologist lamented, in the fixed mindset, imperfections are shameful, especially if you're talented, so they lied them away. What's so alarming is that we took ordinary children and made them into liars simply by telling them they were smart. What if churches worked like math students? Evaluated themselves not on the basis of how skilled they are, but how hard they try. The first church I ever served was one of 4 UCCs in Beverly, Mass. The name of our church was Second Congregational Church. And our unofficial tagline was, "We're number 2, we try harder." I remembered that this week. And I remembered that graphic when thinking about the Pharisees, because they had once been a growth mindset people, dreaming up new ways of being faithful religious community, of listening more closely to God. But after attaining their personal vision, they then became rigid and fixed and tried to lock that down. Because fixed mindset church is perfectionistic. It avoids challenges to its ideology. It's threatened by the success of other churches. It has all the answers, or has to pretend that they have them, because they don't want to be exposed as frauds. It's a church that lives by the myth of scarcity, that there's not enough, there never will be, and because of that, it's ungenerous. And because it's ungenerous, it enacts the reality it most fears. Growth mindset church is church that has a spirit of experimentation, is willing to fail forward, to risk, to look a little ridiculous. It's community that wants to keep learning from all the miracles unfolding around us. It adopts and embraces new people, inventions, and ideas. It genuinely enjoys a good challenge and understands it will take time and hard work from everybody to realize God's goals. It is generous and all in. Here's a tale of 2 churches. I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago preaching the annual meeting of the Florida Conference United Church of Christ. We were staying in a beachside resort, as one often does in the service of the Lord. And it so happens we were not the only gaggle of church people at the Hilton Daytona Beach. There was at the same time a large women's conference put on by the Assemblies of God of North Florida. It was called Thrive. And the poster advertising the conference depicted a young woman in spandex sweating her way through an intense workout. The attendees didn't quite match the marketing. How can I put this delicately? They were mostly white women, heavily made up, hairsprayed, perfumed, which made every slow ride in the small elevator even longer for my besieged nose. At every turn, I found myself surrounded by deeply tanned bosoms boasting large bejeweled crosses. Their numbers overwhelmed, their volume overwhelmed. The God language I heard everywhere bewildered me because it seemed totally disconnected from what was happening in real life or anything I have learned of God. They might as well have been speaking Martian as Christian. On one particular elevator ride, I heard all about how electric Ballroom A had just been with the Spirit of God. But the woman who was telling her friends seemed so possessive and self-satisfied about the Spirit, as if her cohort had just been given a private show. It seemed odd to me that the Spirit would choose to stay pent up in a hotel conference room with all the Atlantic waiting for it just outside the double doors. It seemed like so much well-dressed God polished to a shine. And even as I'm thinking these thoughts, I was ashamed of myself and my catty judgments. How did I really know their hearts? Wasn't I committing the very sin I was accusing them of, thinking I had a monopoly on a true expression of Jesus Christ? Who's the religious hypocrite here? Jesus said, "The tree will be known by its fruit." The next morning, I walked 6 blocks to church to preach, past souvenir shops still boarded up from Hurricane Irma's destruction, praying as I walked about global climate chaos, inviting God to these streets. And I arrived at the beautiful little stone UCC that has withstood many storms, actual and ecclesial, and now is reviving with solid leadership from a 70-year-old retired Episcopal priest who sported an earring and spiked hair, which is so UCC somehow, all of that together. And he and his congregation of young retirees climbed ladders to hang paper mobiles of dancers, interspersed with photos of churches from the chandeliers, so that they could truly welcome their fellow UCCers who had come from all over the state to be together. The church was so proud to host and welcome us. The conference minister, a powerful man, straight white man, stood up in the pulpit, gave a few brief but moving remarks, and then turned the floor over to the people in an open mic town meeting. The first miracle of the day. Someone giving up Moses' seat to the people. First, an older white man stood up and testified about a conversation he'd had with the hotel parking valet as he checked out that morning. They had befriended each other on the first day when all 600 of us good Christians descended simultaneously trying to get our cars parked and check in. The Thrive Conference and the motley pew of UCC folk. Things had gotten a little hectic and hot at check-in. And on this last morning, the man who had gotten up to speak asked her how the valet was doing this morning. She said, "I'll tell you the truth, friend. That other group of Christians gave me the worst day of my life yesterday. They insulted me, they harassed and verbally abused me, and they don't tip either." I admit hearing that was not really great for my practice of non-judgmentalism. Still working on it. Second, a middle-aged white woman stood up and talked about their strategy for the Richard Spencer and white supremacist roadshow coming to Gainesville the following weekend. They were all planning to collect free tickets to the event and then skip it, take them down to the local pub instead, and turn them in for a free beer. Finally, a young African-American father stood up with his 14-year-old son in this mostly white crowd. He talked about how since Trayvon Martin had died, he had been so afraid, never knowing if his child was safe, never knowing if his son's white teachers were really on his side, never being able to let his guard down in the white world. He wept as he spoke. And then he spoke about the welcome he and his son had received in their new church, the genuine love and equality he felt from white people, Latinx people, black people. He spoke of the relief of being spiritually home. I started ugly crying in the back pew. I wasn't alone. We mobbed that father and his son with hugs when the meeting was over, and the conference minister came back to invite the son to be on the Young Adult Leadership Council then and there. The door to that church was wide open. I could taste the salt in the air. I could feel the Holy Spirit moving freely in and out, belonging to no one and everyone. Beloved, it's the season when we consider what our offering to this church will be for the year to come. There is so much we long to do and be. There are so many challenges before us, decisions to make, and potential. When it comes to the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, God has made us able to choose and choose again and choose again every time what we will adopt. Which one do you think you are? I know which one I often choose and what I'd rather be. Which one is our church? Will we decide we're enough? We've reached our limits. We're pretty darn good. We have enough Holy Spirit up in here. Or will we be like the universe that God has made, still expanding, still reaching beyond anything we can imagine? Amen.